Hello, I'm Bob Kuttner. In writing a piece for the Prospect, which is going to be published in our next issue, called Healing America, I had a chance to read an extraordinary book called Learning from the Germans, Race and the Memory of Evil. The author is Susan Nieman. Susan Nieman is an American philosopher and historian who's now the director of the Einstein Forum in Potsdam near Berlin, which was created after the Berlin Wall came down and Germany reunified. And the subject of Susan Nieman's book is the process of German coming to terms with what occurred in World War II and the Holocaust. The word in German is Vergangenheit auf Arbeitung. There's no word in English, there's no concept in English for what translates as working off the past. And what happened in Germany, Neiman reports, is that the generation that came of age in the 1960s really demanded that Germany go through this project, this exercise of agonizing self-reflection. Their parents had not wanted to do that. In fact, she finds most of the people who survived the war and were middle-aged in the period after the war felt that Germany was the victim, not the perpetrator, because they had suffered so badly during the last years of the war and the first years of the post-war. Uh, the analogy that occurred to Neiman is the lack of any such working off the past when it comes to coming to terms with race and slavery in the United States. And this remarkable book that she has written is a comparison of what Germany has done over the past 60 years and what the United States has only barely begun to do. Do you, do you want to start anywhere or shall I just ask questions?
Why don't you ask questions? Because I mean, you sent me some questions, all of which I can answer. I'm not quite sure what your central interest is. It could go in a lot of directions.
My,
So
my,
what?
my
Yeah,
central
go
interest is your work. My central interest is your work, which is just extraordinary. And I'm really so thrilled to be doing this interview with you. So thank you
ahead.
for all of your wonderful work. Um, I think let me start with this rather inflammatory question of Jews in Germany. So, do we really think that Jews right now are safer in Germany than they are in America? And let's unpack that. Why would that be the case?
Of course, they're safer in Germany than in America, and for many reasons. You know, Americans take gun violence for granted in a way that other civilized nations do not. And I know it's hard for you to understand because once one's there, of course, it's just part of the furniture of the universe in the way that,
No, I'm not spent a lot of time in Europe, so I'm aware. Yeah,
yeah. So,
go ahead.
you know, but even when I mean, I find myself sometimes, outside looking in and thinking, my God, who would choose to live there? And of course, when one's there, they're wonderful people that you love and, various, benefits to being in the States. And you simply repress the fact that it's an extraordinarily dangerous country. And not just because of the lack of gun laws, but because of the level of rage, which is something I've been thinking about in trying to understand the election, that there is simply more rage, you know, in many sectors of the population than, again, anywhere I have ever been that's not directly at war. So, I don't think it's an accident that more Jews were killed in these attacks 2 years ago, one in California and one in Ohio. It was Ohio, right? The synagogue where 11 people were murdered that was connected.
It was Pittsburgh.
Was it Pittsburgh? Sorry. You see, it's all starting to, there's too much has happened in the last 4 years. Um, but there are more Jews killed there than anywhere. And that is, something that I realize Americans would like to repressed, but it's simply true. Now, the other side of that, in Germany, yes, there was an attack on a synagogue. It was foiled, fortunately. Um, and the people who have been killed in Germany in the last couple of years by right-wing radicals have been people of color, okay, rather than Jews. And right-wing violence towards anyone is not something I would ever be inclined to minimize. But as a matter of fact, because of Germany's peculiar relationship to Jews, and I'm not saying this is a nice thing, but all synagogues have police details, and all Jewish institutions have police details. So, as a matter of fact, Jews are physically safer here than in the United States of America or in the state of Israel, but for different reasons. So yes, it is actually a physically very safe place to live as a Jew. It's not a place where, you can feel easily and comfortably Jewish in the way that you do in New York, okay? And there are people like this political scientist Yasha Monk, who wrote his first book was sort of how awful it was to grow up in Bavaria as a Jew, and how wonderful it is to live in the States. He lives in Cambridge, Mass, and New York is just fine. But if he would go to Texas or Mississippi or Oklahoma, which is really quite comparable to growing up in a village in Bavaria, it would be a very different picture.
But I mean, one of the things you write about in your book is how Jews are still rather exotic in Germany, and Germans tiptoe around the fact that they're Jewish and all of that. I mean, does that make it safer or weirder, or a little both to be?
Weirder, but the scenes that you're referring to in the book were mostly from the 80s. You see, I've been here since 1982 with a decade-long break elsewhere. And so I've been able to follow the development. Yes, when I first came here, it was very weird, very uncomfortable, not just to be a Jew, but to be any kind of a foreigner, which is why I ultimately decided to leave in 1988. I had my first child, and I thought this is just too weird an atmosphere, to grow up in. Do you say you're Jewish? Do not say you're Jewish. If you say that you're Jewish, you get a whole range of weird reactions, everything from, I never liked Woody Allen, by the way, even before all the sexual assault allegations. But, I've been in situations where, say I was Jewish and the person sitting next to me would say, I love Woody Allen. And I would say, mm-hmm. But I mean, in a way, it's like if you saw the movie Get Out. Did you see that? Great movie. It's like the white father who says, I would have voted for a third term for Barack Obama. I mean, it's that kind of, over kind of, to any stray Black person who wanders into his, in his orbit. So that has changed very much. It in the 80s, there were very few Jews of any kind. There were some German Jews or Jews whose parents, or Germans whose parents had been Jews and who were sort of metaphorically in hiding. They had not been raised with any kind of Jewish consciousness. They'd been given, very non-Jewish names like, Yvonne or Alexandra or something. Whereas, interestingly, this started to be a trend among, Germans of that generation. They would all call their children Jakob, which was the other going in the other direction. So it was, it was definitely not a place where you could be comfortably Jewish or even comfortably foreign. When I was here in the 80s, my best friends were Chilean exiles, interestingly enough. Just kind of by accident, but also kind of not. There were lots of them who came after the putsch in Chile. And, there was also a Greek thinker who had come even earlier after the putsch in Greece. So there was I was in a kind of border community, artists, bohemians, but very often a lot of foreigners. There just simply were not many Jews at all, of any kind,
So,
and that changed. Sorry, go ahead.
so I mentioned, yeah, I mentioned in our correspondence, I mentioned Philip Roth. So Roth writes this novel in 1993, proposing typical Philip Roth. He invents a whole imaginary ideology, which he calls diasporism, as a counterpoint to Zionism. And supposedly this ideology holds that the brief Nazi era, even though it was horrific, was a historic mistake, and that the whole many century sweep of Jewish life in Europe shows that Europe was where Jews reached the pinnacle of their cultural and artistic achievement. And therefore, the historic task of the Jews is not to go back to Israel, but to go back to Europe. Now, was he prophetic somewhat in that respect? Is this actually starting to happen?
It's a really interesting question. I have a good friend. She's an Italian Jew who's based in Paris. So very, multi-European. And she actually was working on a book and a number of initiatives in which she wanted to argue something quite similar without the humor. That is, that Jews had been traditionally the best Europeans. And so if we were talking about European integration, which is still a problem, as you can see, given how hard it is to get 27 now European countries to agree on most of anything, if that Jews could be the agents of integration. And she was writing a book, and she managed to get funding, I think, from the Ford Foundation. There were some very nice, seminars in a chateau in Normandy that, where she had, brought together Jews from all over Europe. And in the end, and I have to give her credit. She tore up her contract and gave back the book. And she said, I have to give up my thesis. There's not enough of a critical mass. It's not going to happen. Now, she sees in principle there would be the potential, but there simply are not enough. This was about 15, 16 years ago that she gave up the project. And, I should ask her the next time I see her whether she thinks it could be resurrected. Because the numbers are growing. It really does depend on a critical mass. The numbers are growing. I just saw something that made me quite happy. There's a sort of German organization that's basically modeled after MoveOn.com, whose list I'm on. And I just got a plea to sign something, and it was a Muslim born in Berlin and a Russian Jew born in Berlin who were active on the part of the Uyghurs in concentration camps in Xinjiang, and the young Jew specifically said, I was brought up hearing never again, and look at this, they're concentration camps in China. And I just thought, and I looked him up, I'd never heard of him. He's young, must be in his early 20s. And I thought, if more of that starts happening, then we actually, maybe we can have the critical mass. it's interesting. So you are not counted. You cannot count the number of Jews in the country unless you officially belong to the Jewish community. Belonging to the Jewish community, it's an official act. It also tithes 1% of your income, which not everybody can afford. But beyond that, it also puts you in the middle of a community that is, first of all, extremely right wing. I mean, Israel, right or wrong, that sort of thing, very
Yeah, yeah.
tribal, and at each other's throats to the point of, suing each other, so that, they've been within the community saying, my God, not in front of the Goyim, and how can we do this in Germany? I mean, it's really bad news. Now, officially 200,000 people in Germany belong to that community, but I don't. And I suspect none of the American Jews who continue to come do. I know the Israeli Jews do not. And so there's this sort of between 25 and 40,000 Israeli Jews live in Berlin. But again, nobody has an exact count of how many it
Do you
is.
have a ballpark estimate of how many Jews there are in Germany now, sort of
Well,
official and unofficial?
that's my problem, is there's no way to get an unofficial count. Unless people officially join the, there's not a census that checks your religion or whatever. My guess would be that it's at least twice as many as the official number, which is 200,000, and perhaps even more. But
So not that far below pre-war Germany.
Indeed.
Wow.
But certainly not as integrated into German society as they were. But here, I mean, for example, he doesn't like talking about it, but the president of the German Historical Museum, which is in this very imposing building right on Unter den Linden. I mean, it's big state. He's a Swiss Jew. So I mean, that's a fairly significant. He likes talking about it even less than Barack Obama liked talking about the fact that he was Black, but there it is. So
let's go over to the flip side of this, which is Jews in America. I mean, one can paint a picture of Jews having really dodged a bullet with Trump, in that he demonized every other traditionally hated group, and Jews sort of got a free pass, mainly because of his son-in-law. This has been a Jewish strategy going back to biblical times, and it hasn't worked out all that well for most of Jewish history. And there was a tug of war in the White House between Bannon, who was really encouraging Trump to be more explicit in his dog whistle anti-Semitic tropes, and Kushner, who was really striving for control for its own sake, but en passant was damping down the anti-Semitism. And I had something to do with Bannon getting fired. I mean, Bannon got fired the week of Charlottesville.
Congratulations. Were you behind that? Oh, wow. That's a mitzvah, if ever I heard of one.
Right. Well, what happened was that Bannon noticed that I had been writing a lot of stuff critical of the way Trump was fulminating about China, but not doing anything serious about China as a geoeconomic and geopolitical threat. So Bannon called me up as if we were old friends, because he's always looking for allies anywhere on the political spectrum. And I had the wit to record the phone call. And he said some incredibly unflattering, uncautious things about his boss. And so I wrote the story the next day. That was the day after Charlottesville. And they canned him. So I want that on my tombstone because it's one of my few real world accomplishments. But had Bannon had Trump not had a Jewish son-in-law, and had Bannon not gotten canned, the level of sub rosa anti-Semitism in the United States that only needs to be kindled by a president legitimatizing it is enormous. And the next aspiring neo-fascist might not have a Jewish son-in-law. So it really does make me think. And I'm from New York, and New York feels very safe. But you go outside New York, we've all had experiences where casual and not so casual anti-Semitic remarks get dropped.
You know, I mean, I agree with you entirely, and I'm full of gratitude that you have get rid of Bannon. I wondered exactly how that how that
It was dumb luck. He called me, and I turned on the recorder. But anyway,
what
right place
exactly
at the right time.
say? What exactly did he say about?
He basically said that Trump was a fool. I mean, Bannon was in the habit of calling reporters off the record relentlessly, and he neglected to say that we were off the record. And this is supposedly the savviest media operative in the world. So I just assumed if he didn't bother to say we were off the record, he was on the record. And I had no, compunction about burning him. So the story ran the next day, and the day after that, he was fired, and I was famous for 15 minutes. But
It's funny, maybe I just didn't know because I had no context for your name at that point. So if it was there, I missed the fame. I
okay.
certainly was following Bannon and Charlottesville. My God.
Yeah.
And also insisting that we call Charlottesville, by its right name. These weren't neo-Nazis. There was nothing neo about them. These were Nazis. They had
Absolutely.
yeah, but there are people kept talking about neo-Nazis, and I wanted to know what was new. There was, it was, but look, it's not just that Trump has a Jewish son-in-law. I think somehow American Jews have got to address this crazy alliance between right-wing Jews and Christian evangelicals. Yeah.
It's
And
crazy. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, and this is a problem that goes way deeper than Donald Trump. It goes certainly at least back to the Bush regime, and which is why it's something that we need to address. And I'll tell you why we need to address it. I mean, it's not only because, as I'm sure you know, their philo-Semitism wants to send us all to hell after they blow up the Middle East in its apocalyptic splendor. So, the idea that Netanyahu and others had, well, we can use them. We need all the friends we can get is a very dangerous game. Secondly, of course, it supports these right-wing and fully unjust policies in the state of Israel. But one of the things that I'm sure you're less aware of, because you have to be outside of the country a lot and having these conversations, other people outside the States do not know about the Christian evangelicals. And they ask themselves why the US constantly supports this right-wing policy in Israel, and they conclude protocols of the elders of Zion were right. The Jews do run America. They really believe that. They believe that Jews run US policy. And I mean, I have written articles about this. I've held, organized workshops on this. And, it gets a minute of attention and then it goes off. And every time I tell people, no, 75% of American Jews are against this policy. It's the Christian evangelicals who want to convert us or send us to hell. And they're shocked by this. So it is, if people are talking about, just one last sentence. If people are worrying about rising anti-Semitism in the world, they need to, do something about this alliance, because it is really a sort of typical Jews standing in the front line for a bunch of policies that are, hurting the world, that are actually not Jewish. Sorry, I keep.
Well, it's even worse than that. I just want to pull something off the shelf. Hold on a sec. This this is a
Uh,
piece that I wrote for the this is a
oh,
piece that I wrote for the Republic in 1986,
wow.
and the origins of this is so nefarious. I mean, the origins of this are the Republican Party trying to peel away money and votes from Jews who were ordinarily liberal on domestic issues and who ordinarily vote for Democrats by being twice as loyal to Israel.
Yeah.
And this dates to Reagan's alliance with the Christian evangelicals,
Okay.
which was completely cynical because um, Paul Weyrich, who was actually Catholic, and other Protestant evangelicals negotiate this alliance with Reagan, and then the right wing Republicans realize that sucking up to Israel is a great strategy for peeling off Jewish campaign money and some Jewish votes. And so in the 80s, there were all these right wing Republican senators who tried to be more pro Israel than their Democratic opponents. And Al D'Amato did this in New York, and Paula Hawkins did this in Florida, and Kasten did it in in Wisconsin. And so I was working for Marty Peretz at the time, who was the owner of the New Republic,
Yeah.
who was crazily Zionist. And I pitched this piece to Marty, thinking that I was putting my head in the news. And Marty actually encouraged me to do the piece because he really didn't like this. It was one of his rare good deeds. So this goes back a very, a very long time, and it is insidious because it not only has the effect that you described, but it also pushes the American Jewish community in a slightly further right-wing direction on the subject of Israel.
It's, but it's something we really need to stand up about. Um, I've been heartened by Peter Beinart's development lately. He's really moving in the right direction, and he's a voice of a younger generation of Jews, who's, got some, media power. The other thing is, I've got to say this, although my late lamented friend Tony Judd got death threats for saying this. Um, we are feeding anti-Semitism. The state of Israel is feeding international anti-Semitism.
Dual
And
loyalty.
Pardon?
Dual loyalty. It's the old libel.
No, it's not even that. It's not that at all. It's the fact that, I mean, I lived in Israel for 5 years, and my Israeli friends, the ones who are left, are very active in the peace movement. I don't know if you read, if you read the New York Review on Israel, then you've read David Schulman, who's a good friend of mine, chairman of my board. This is somebody who goes out into the territories every week and defends Palestinians against Israeli settlers. And I decided I wasn't going to support BDS, but I decided my private version of BDS was, if I go to Israel, I don't do it very often, but occasionally I'm invited, then I will spend a day out in the territories with David and this group that he works with. And I was shocked the first time I went. I mean, the sort of standard left-wing Israeli thing to do is to say, it's occupied territory, so I won't set foot in it, which is what I did during the 5 years that I lived there. But what that means is it's half an hour away from where you live, or an hour away from where you live at most. You don't actually see the conditions on the ground. It is apartheid. It is, just no two ways about it. And other countries know about it. So, at the moment, the Israeli government, and at the moment means he's been the prime minister for longer than anybody, it is one of the most right-wing racist governments in the world. Moreover, it weaponizes anti-Semitism and the Holocaust to, undercut any kind of critique, and people see that. So it's not the dual loyalty problem, it's the problem that Israel itself, in its present form for the last 20 years, is really contributing to anti-Semitism. Germany is a weird case on that. We can talk about that if you want to. But if American Jews don't withdraw their support for this government, and and don't show up. I just saw there's a new film out on the alliance, between the crazy evangelicals and the Orthodox Jewish community. If people don't start shouting about what that's about, we're really in trouble. I mean, Trump did actually say it, and once in a while, the man succeeds in saying a true sentence. He said, "I moved the capital because of the evangelicals, not because of the Jews. The Jews don't thank me for it." Um,
Well, I think the punchline of this is it's no longer possible to say with any credibility whatsoever that if somebody is anti the current version of Israel, they're anti-Semitic. I mean, that contention, Netanyahu can argue this, but that contention has less and less credibility, and it does cycle back to dual loyalty, because the more loathsome that Israeli policy becomes, the harder it is for American Jews to defend Israel without looking like they're loyal to a foreign government. So it reinforces the old dual
I
loyalty
just,
choice. But I think you're right. The essence of it.
I see what you're saying, but I think, at the time when it was internationally seen as a place of hope and kibbutzim and making
Right.
the desert bloom and all of that, you could feel less bad about dual loyalty, in the same way that, of course, times have changed. But with our second Catholic president, he's president under Pope Francis. I love Pope Francis. So, if it were Benedict, it might, or John Paul, you might have a different feeling. But the point is, the world is looking at this, and the world is fucking better informed. I mean, this gets me pissed even when I read, I spend way too much time reading, trying to compare various different, news takes on various things in the world. I mean, in Der Spiegel, Der Spiegel this week had a long interview with Svetlana Alexandrievich, Nobel laureate, about the situation in Belarus. 6 pages. It also had a long and detailed report on the way in which the Duterte government in the Philippines is using COVID, for really quite semi-fascist acts of repression. And I mean, these are things that Americans don't have a picture of what's going on in the world. And other people do. Other people are simply better informed. And they're informed about Israel. And, the identification of America with Israel, or Jews with Israel, is the identification with, an apartheid state. That's all there is.
Well, let's come back to the subject of your book, uh, learning from the Germans. Uh, I don't know after reading your book whether to be more optimistic or more pessimistic. And for those who haven't read it, it's one part Germany's odyssey since starting to come to terms with its past in a serious, systematic way, and then one part a look at the United States and how just uh, the process has only barely begun, and maybe not even begun in the United States. Do you, I mean, after your uh, own time in Mississippi and elsewhere in the Deep South, and after you've seen what Germany has done, are you hopeful a little bit that we can embark on this journey as Americans?
Absolutely. And I was very pleased that a lot of people have called the book hopeful. Um, and I mean, where should I start? First of all, there's a lot of interest, and there's a lot of interest. I've been spending the last months of my life on Zoom, which I'm kind of happy to do. Um, tend to be a low digital, well, prefer to be a low digital person, but here we are. And after colleges and universities, the most requests for talks come from Jewish organizations, Holocaust research centers, Holocaust museums. Last night I did something in Toronto. They ran a 3-part series on the book where they brought me together in one of them with an indigenous activist, but then there was an Afro-Canadian discussing it. I mean, and I mean, this brings me back just, for a moment to the Jewish question. As I'm sure Judaism has both a universalist and a tribalist strain in it. And they're both there. You can't, I mean, they're both in the Bible, they're both even in the Haggadah. And, I was raised in the universalist strain and was therefore shocked when I got a little older and realized, oh, that's not what all Jews take for granted. But I would say that, and you see it in the election in Georgia, this universalist strain in Judaism is still very much alive and perhaps being reawakened, particularly in the light of Black Lives Matter, although before that too. I mean, I know that there were synagogues organizing groups of people to go down to the border with Mexico to help refugees, but particularly since Black Lives Matter. So the response to the book in the US has made me extremely hopeful. I thought the title would be way more provocative, and it was in 2016 when I started the work. In fact, there was an NEH grant which everybody swore I was a shoo-in for, and the first 2 jurors said yes, give it to her, and then, but it was nixed because the comparison was too tendentious to substitute. And 3 years later, one more. 3 years later, when I came, when I was on book tour, not a single person complained about the title. On the contrary, after 3 years of Donald Trump and after Charlottesville, it was clear to a lot of Americans that we could learn something from the Germans, and Black Lives Matter made that all the more clear, it seems to me.
Well, I can see how it's very hopeful if you shine a light, on Jews. Let me just turn the phone off. I can see that it's a source of hope if you're thinking about the response in the Jewish community. I'm looking at the broader project of whether America can come to terms with its past, not just slavery and segregation, but also the genocide against Native peoples. And, I did a mini version of this Odyssey for the piece I wrote in the Prospect this month, just interviewing a lot of people who try and do work crossing tribal boundaries, getting people to acknowledge each other as human beings. Damn it, there you go. And, on the one hand, there's a lot of good stuff going on. On the other hand, this country still voted for Donald Trump. It almost voted for Donald Trump again. And you have all of the stories from Mississippi that are one part hope. You can point to people who are trying to do this work. And you also point to the massive cultural resistance, because this is our history and this is where we grew up, and we have an affinity to place, an affinity to history. And unfortunately, that affinity goes with a narrative that we were the victims of the Civil War. We weren't the perpetrators of slavery. So, the Enlightenment is a long-term project. I think that's the most hopeful thing one can say. But in the near term, defined as decades, are you hopeful that the German example will help Americans begin to come to terms and do the work that the Germans have done about coming to terms with their past?
I am. And I didn't mean to only focus on the Jews. It's just something that I realized, and I did this thing last night, and I just realized I keep getting these, requests from Holocaust education people. But
Yeah.
but no, the stories that you were, or the groups that you were describing reminded me very much of my time in Mississippi and other places in the Deep South. And that made me hopeful to start with. And here's the kicker. This was a real epiphany for me. Americans tend to think that because, Nazis serve as a symbol of absolute evil without really knowing either where they came from or what happened afterwards. It's just this, sort of large, terrifying object that honestly, even some books that claim to, be talking about it don't bother to do the research. So the assumption is the minute the war was over, the German nation got on its knees and begged for forgiveness once they saw the concentration camps. Um, and that belief, I believe, was furthered by the fact that if people have one iconic photo in their heads of post-war Germany, it's Willy Brandt on his knees at the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial. What they do not know is that the majority of Germans thought that was a terrible gesture, that he shouldn't have done it, that Brandt was, pardon?
Yes, I agree. I agree.
Um,
I'm just agreeing with you.
yeah, and that in fact, um, I suddenly realized the first 4 decades of post-war West Germans, at least, sounded exactly like the defenders of the lost cause. We were victims. Our, cities were in ashes. Our men were wounded or in POW camps if they were alive. We were hungry. And on top of it, the damn Yankees wanted to blame us for starting the war. And once I realized that, I realized it could also be actually quite hopeful. And, when I was talking to friends and colleagues who were activists doing this work, I said, wow, it took the Germans. That's how the Germans saw themselves. Yeah, it is. And and I realized that's actually a fairly natural turn. We would like to see our people as heroes. If we can't see them as heroes, we'll, say, well, history made them victims. But what the Germans did historically, for the first time that any country ever did, was to say, yeah, we suffered a lot after the war, but other people suffered more, and it was our fault. And that's not a move that, you know, another country has made to that effect, but it didn't make it easily, it didn't make it willingly, and we shouldn't be surprised that there's the
But as,
kind of pushback that you're worried about.
but as you point out in the book, um, the Holocaust and the German starting of World War II and the extremism of Hitler was relatively recent, was relatively highly focused. The evil of it, once you allowed yourself to look it in the eye, was impossible to deny. Whereas the Civil War was 170 years ago, and you said, I think at one point in the book, we really ought to start the clock in the 1960s. But even so, the history is more diffuse. It's not. In other words, if you try to come to terms with the history, even after Black Lives Matter, uh, the evil is not quite as concentrated, maybe, as it was in the case of Germany, and that makes it more diffuse and a little more difficult to come to terms with and a little easier to hide from. Is that wrong?
Let me push back a little bit on that. I mean, of course, the two histories are different. No two histories are alike,
Right.
say I'm a socialist, but I'm not a Marxist. I don't believe that there are eternal laws of history that, work for everybody, and that's a good thing. Of course, they're different, but to say that, I mean, what was short-lived in Germany was this period where Jews were actually allowed to play a role in society. 1914, in order to get a position at the Academy of Sciences, people had to write letters. There was a letter written for Albert Einstein, who was already known that he was going to be a Nobel laureate, and he discovered relativity theory and all that stuff. There was a letter saying, Mr. Einstein is free of any unpleasant Jewish characteristics. This is 1914, So, I mean, it's, we talk about the German-Jewish symbiosis. It was really brief and not very, not very solid. I mean, Walter Rathenau was assassinated in 20, there was, I don't at all go with Goldhagen's thesis that it's the one theme running through German history, but it was a theme that ran through German history, and we shouldn't forget that.
Right.
That's the one thing. The second thing is, well, first of all, I think one of the most important things that I learned in doing this research was that the real crime was not just slavery, but the extension of slavery for a good 100 years. And that's why I would date it from the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And I was shocked to realize how much of a black hole that whole period is for white people, even for educated white people, even for, I've met American history professors who know virtually nothing about Reconstruction. And the whole has been covered up by the word Jim Crow. I'm on a little campaign to get people to stop using the word Jim Crow because it's a euphemism which suggests, okay, there were racist stereotypes and there were racial prejudices, but it wasn't the age of racial terror, which is what Brian Stevenson calls it. I mean, his work is just enormous in awe of what he's done. But once you read about that, once you read about neo-slavery in the form of convict leasing, which I talk about in the book, and the funny thing was all hiding in plain sight. Who hasn't seen a picture of a chain gang? But since we didn't know about the whole legal mechanisms, we figured, well, it looks a little brutal, but I guess they're criminals. Um, and so you had 100 years of forms of slavery light that were absolutely suppressed, and in that sense, I would argue, first of all, slavery is closer, or at least the impact of slavery is closer in time than we give it credit for. It didn't end in 1865. And the German anti-Semitism goes back further in time than 1933, So, once again, if to argue that countries can learn from each other doesn't mean you have to argue their histories are exactly alike. It just means there are enough points of similarity where where we can learn from each other.
I want to ask another question. I'm not sure if this is relevant, but I tend to focus a lot on economics. Was it a little easier that the second German generation was able to explore this at a time when Germany was prosperous and thriving, whereas right now, white working class people are downwardly mobile and in the market for scapegoats, which makes it harder?
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. And I think the reason why our right wing party is stronger in the East is that the East has been economically, not only economically behind the West, but symbolically tremendously so. You know, you have 1.7% of the leadership of everything from, business to government to media to universities is in the hands of people from the East, which is really shocking. And so there's quite a lot of rage also at the ways in which they feel looked down upon, and they are looked down upon, I must say, by Westerners. So I agree with you that economics is a really important factor in all of this. And in fact, it's my strong belief that some of the rage in the United States on both sides is because we live in a barbaric social system by standards of other developed countries. People don't recognize how barbaric it is because I just have this experience all the time. Even when I tell educated friends about what the social system of Germany is like, they look at me as if I'm talking about paradise. So people don't actually know that it's an option. Um, and Bernie Sanders made a terrible mistake in always referring to Scandinavia, because then it's very easy to say, okay, it's a small, homogenous part of the world. Germany is the fourth largest economic power, and in the world. And Sanders' proposals were quite to the right of Angela Merkel, which makes people laugh when I tell them that, but it's true, you know. And here's just one example that came up during the pandemic. Europeans followed, the debates over Obamacare, although they found it impossible to make sense of. But at least it means that they knew that Americans have no universal health care policies. It did not occur to them that we have no universal sick leave policies. And of course, European sick leave is a completely different animal. What happens when you're sick? If you're only sick for 3 days, all you have to do is call in and tell your employer. And you are paid and you stay home. If you're sick for longer than that, you have to go to the doctor and get a note from the doctor. And he writes down how long he expects you to be away from work, and you can get it renewed if you get sick. And when you explain to Germans how this functions or doesn't function in the United States, it's not just that they think it's too bad, they think it is absolutely crazy barbaric, especially in the middle of a pandemic. So, and it is crazy and barbaric that people have to go to work when they're sick or lose their homes. Now, it's my view that Americans, because they don't know that there's an alternative, um, you know, don't actually realize why they're so angry, but that living in this, quite crazy and barbaric system where people need 2 or 3 jobs, and even people who are well off bankrupting themselves to send their children to college or, medical treatments or whatever. Um, and not to mention, I mean, basically we get 6 weeks paid vacation. Everybody gets 6 weeks paid vacation here. It's just, um, and it's seen by employers as good for people's health and good for business, because you have, healthy, rested workers who, so anyway, the absence of all of that in the United States, I think, is, sort of fuels a kind of underground rage through many sectors of society. And of course, the easiest way to get rid of rage is to take it out on the next foreigner, rather than to understand it in systematic terms. And I'm sure that this has been an old trick of capital since, the end of the 19th century. You divide, you had these alliances of white and black workers, even in the South, and you use racism to tear it apart. And here we are.
So you take that baseline economic frustration that's inchoate. People don't have a political analysis of this, and the rage that it produces, and then on top of that, you say to white people, by the way, you have a moral obligation to look deeply at your past, at the way that you and your ancestors oppressed black people for 400 years. A lot of whites are going to say, no, thanks. I've got enough problems. And I
Well,
think that adds to the resistance.
I think the word privilege is a problem, even
Oh my
though
God. Yes.
I acknowledge that, being white does give a form of privilege. I think hearing the word privilege, for many people in those situations is, like waving a red flag in their face. I get it.
Very tough. It's very tough. I wanted to mention one other thing that I really appreciated about your book, and that was your acknowledgement of the role that the DDR, East Germany, played after the war and the demonization of the DDR. Uh, Americans just don't know about this. I mean, I went over there. USIS sent me over there in 1990, right after the wall came down, and they also sent me, God help me, to Northern Ireland. And I lectured at Humboldt. And, people kept coming up to me and saying, not everything here was bad. And that's just so anathema to the way the United States understands the Cold War, even well-educated people. And yeah, the DDR was not a nice place in many respects, but in terms of coming to terms with the Holocaust, in terms of ordinary people just having a decent life. And I thought your other point that just Americans don't know about was the fact that all the stuff that was hauled off to the Soviet Union, the recovery in the DDR, much, much more arduous than in the West. So it's always appalling how much history educated people don't know. That's what I keep coming up against. And that's the great contribution of your work.
Well, I appreciate your singling that out because that chapter has brought me hate mail from some people. Um, and I had it fact checked by two German historians because I knew people were going to go over,
Yeah.
rake it over the coals. I have come to think, and particularly in the reactions to that actually the piece of our history that we have most resisted working off is Cold War history. And that
Yes.
it is such a pervasive part of, I mean, not just in the US, it's a problem in other places too, but let me confine myself, since you're the American prospect, let me confine myself to talking about the US. The smartest and most perfidious thing that McCarthy ever did was to name that committee the House Un-American Activities Committee, because it was a way of wiping out the fact that there was a robust American socialist movement in the 30s, in the 40s. You may know this, it's one of my favorite little facts. Paul Robeson's Ballad for Americans was the only song sung at the Democratic, Republican, and Communist Party conventions of 1940. And it's so patriotic that it's almost painful to listen to today. But Paul Robeson's one of my heroes. I'm going to be writing something about him. So I'm, thinking about that. And of course, the reason he went from what Du Bois called the most famous American in the world, not just famous Black person, to being virtually unknown to the next generation is because he was deliberately destroyed for being a socialist. I actually think the anti-communism is worse today than it was in the 50s, because in the 50s, most people would have known someone who had been a socialist or a communist. It wasn't the boogeyman. And secondly, one saw directly the effects of anti-communism and was worried about it. I think it is hardened into fact, like, I don't know, trees come from seeds or something, that communism is evil and was evil, and that there was nothing good about it. It plays a role in contemporary politics. I actually think that what killed Bernie Sanders in South Carolina was the discussion of Cuba. I don't know if you remember, but just before the South Carolina primary, somebody came up with something he'd said about the Cuban health system in the 70s. And, Bernie, God bless him, he sort of dug down and said, well, did he support Cuba? Was he going to, what do you had something on MSNBC saying Bernie Sanders become president, he's going to shoot people like me in Central Park? I mean, this is the picture of socialism, and Sanders said, well, I don't support any authoritarian country, be it Cuba, Saudi Arabia, or China, but they have a very good health system. He could have added, because I've been in Cuba, they had the best educational system in all of Latin America, but I think that killed him. And, it's mind-blowing how little. I mean, I'm a sort of tail end of the 60s kid, so I was just old enough to think that part of being a grown-up was you read the history of the Russian Revolution, or you knew this stuff. And of course, that has all been wiped out, and I think very much to our peril when we damn, once again, Angela Merkel is a center-right politician. And, the fact that any of her social policies weren't even up for discussion in the United States ought to show us just how far right we've gone, and how badly we need to examine the history of socialist movements, the history of labor movements, and the weaponizing of the charge of socialism.
So to conclude, I guess it's fair to say we have a lot to learn from the Germans, not just how to come to terms with our own history. And I think both things, learning from the German social system and also learning from the German historical excavation, is going to be a heavy lift, and we have to be optimistic about it.
Yeah, I was very optimistic after Black Lives Matter, became such a large social movement in June, and, with more white people than Black people being involved. I don't support every single thing that Black Lives Matter has done, but basically, I really do think it's a sign that the United States is in the process of what the Germans call working off the past. And I remain cautiously hopeful.
Susan, thank you so much for this conversation and for your work. And let's stay in touch.
It's a pleasure to talk to. Hope we'll meet sometime when,
I hope so too.